Welcome back, everyone. Let's begin this video by looking at an objection raised by an Islamic website against the theory that the Quran does indeed borrow from the Alexander Romance in Surah 18. Here it is posted on the Islamic Awareness website. If Muslims try to respond at all to this video, it will most likely be using websites like this. So let's cut this objection off before it starts. Let's look at his sources. He's included numerous citations throughout the article. He has a table to help his readers out, as well as a diagram. Now, this all comes from an article that he's referenced in a footnote. You can see it down here, Brandon Wheeler, Moses or Alexander, and this is from the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. Now, what he's doing here is actually intellectually dishonest because he's using Wheeler's article long before he cites it. In fact, what he's done on some occasions is pulled footnotes out of Wheeler's article in the same order, in the same format, and cited them in his write-up to make it look as though he's consulted these sources independently. But he's actually not. He's just copying them from Wheeler's article without explicitly saying so. Here's a footnote from Wheeler's article, and he cites these two sources with these page numbers. We go to the write-up on this Islamic website, and guess what we see? The same two sources in the same order with the exact same page numbers. In addition, there are numerous places in this article on the Islamic website that follow very, very closely Brandon Wheeler's wording, altered just slightly without explicitly citing Wheeler's article once again. It seems that in defending the Quran's plagiarism of the Alexander Romance stories, this author has plagiarized an article from an academic journal. How ironic. Now, aside from all of that, though, we still have an article published in a peer-reviewed journal which says that the Quran did not borrow from the Alexander Romance story in Surah 18. Citing him properly instead of plagiarizing this time, he quotes, "Surah 18 is not necessarily derived from the Alexander stories. On the contrary, more discerning examination of the different texts show that the later recensions of the Alexander stories are dependent upon the Quran." So I guess we're finished. The Quran did not borrow from the Alexander Romance. Just kidding. Let's jump into a 2007 essay written by Kevin Van Bladel, published in The Quran and Its Historical Context. He says the present investigation will show that the Quran is retelling the story found in this particular Syriac text, but that is just the beginning of the matter. Now, as we've seen from the Islamic Awareness website, Brandon Wheeler's article is heavily relied upon, and his work is cited in this essay by Kevin Van Bladel. And it's not good. He says, moreover, some recent scholarship has brought considerable confusion into the study of Alexander's stories in relation to the Quran. Who do you think he cites in this footnote? Brandon Wheeler, Moses or Alexander, the exact same article we saw from the Islamic Awareness website. He says, Wheeler does not directly address Naldeki's hypothesis of the relationship of the Alexander legend to the Quran. This strikes me as an unfortunate oversight. He says Wheeler has overlooked a good deal of relevant published research, but has almost completely avoided getting into the details of the text that could be used to establish their real interrelationships. In his charts, and this is rather comical, Wheeler suggests that the Babylonian Talmud is a source of the Christian Song of Alexander, which is extremely unlikely. He also makes the point against Wheeler that just because the Quranic commentators are relying on a prior tradition, which they clearly are, does not mean that the Quran isn't also. And on the sources Wheeler has missed, well, here's a list. And he's not the only one who says this. A very confused and confusing discussion about the relationship between the Quran and various texts concerning Alexander and Gilgamesh is found in Wheeler, 1998. Again, Brandon Wheeler, who dismisses any direct relationship between the Quran and the Alexander legend, has attempted to challenge the dominant views concerning the dependence of the Quran on the Alexander tale. The results he achieves are highly doubtful. For a critique of Wheeler's study, see Kevin Van Bladel. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. Now, I was told by a specialist in this field via private communication that the work by Brandon Wheeler has been forgotten. Also, to use his word, everybody believes that the Quran is drawing from these prior Alexander traditions. So we're going to dig in a bit deeper and find out why. We'll follow Kevin Van Bladel's scheme as he separates this narrative into 5 parts. We have an introduction, a couple of journeys, and these are the notorious or famous, depending on how you look at it, the rising and the setting place of the sun. We also have God's first-person warning of events to come. Now, as most of you know, many of the correspondences between the Syriac and the Arabic stories are so obvious that they do not need special attention. Simply relating both stories establishes their extraordinary similarity. But I want to communicate these similarities very clearly to our Muslim audience, so I've extracted some of them from the article and paired them with the associated verses in the Quran. When Alexander came to the people in the West, he tested the efficacy of the deadly fetid waters with the lives of convicts. This helps us explain the option given in the Quran, for no apparent reason, to either punish the people or to do them a kindness. Of course, in the Quran, we read al-Zulqarnain, either punish or show them kindness. Of course, the setting of the sun gets plenty of attention in this narrative for obvious reasons, but protection from the sun or lack thereof doesn't get enough attention. There's a very close parallel to that as well in the Alexander romance. The Syriac text has Alexander travel from that point near to where the sun sets, in the direction of the place where the sun rises, same as in the Quran. And it is only this Syriac text that explains the meaning of 1890, where the otherwise unknown Eastern people have no cover from the sun. Of course, the Quran, the setting of the sun and the spring of murky water, but then here in 1890 it says, until when we came to the rising of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom we had provided no covering protection against the sun. A very close and conspicuous parallel indeed. Here's another one. We have some people who can hardly understand speech, and they're explained in the Syriac text as Huns. In the Quran, we read about people who scarcely understood a word. Also, Zulqarnain's ability to build a wall of iron is explained in the Syriac story, and we have corresponding parallels in the Quran. And here's one that I think is very important because it gets a little bit into theology and eschatology. Most importantly, in both texts, the hero issues a prophecy upon completing the fortification, foretelling the end of the world in a time of great battles among nations. He continues, thus quite strikingly, almost every element of this short Quranic tale finds a more explicit and detailed counterpart in the Syriac Alexander legend. But there aren't just thematic or narrative parallels, there are also linguistic parallels as well. The water at the place where the sun sets is fetid in both texts, a perfect coincidence of 2 uncommon synonyms. He then goes on to list numerous more technical parallels before concluding, and catch this, if there were a closer correspondence of the Syriac and Arabic, it would be possible to argue that one was just a much modified translation of the other. The theological problems that this creates for Muslims who believe the Quran to be the word of Allah cannot be overstated. Now, what about the date of this legend? The Alexander legend is an apocalyptic text in which the ancient Alexander is portrayed as presenting a prophecy written long ago for events to come. Thus, the date of composition for such apocalypses can often be found by locating the latest point at which events allegedly predicted match actual historical events. Where the events predicted diverge from history, there one usually can find the date of the composition. Now, there are 2 dates that are of interest to us from the Syriac legend. The first equates to about 514 to 15 CE. The second of the 2 dates converts to about 628 or 629 CE. Now, drawing off of other scholars' work, he says it has persuasively been argued that the Alexander legend was composed just after 628, perhaps in 630. He continues, by now it should be amply clear that the Alexander legend is the product of a very specific, identifiable historical and cultural environment, the end of a devastating war widely believed to carry eschatological implications, ending with Heraclius' campaign in 628 and in 629 with the final withdrawal of the Persian armies. And remember, Muslims argue for that mid-7th century date for the Quran, not based on proof, but based on tradition. But the plot thickens. In the early 20th century, Russian scholars discovered a number of Pahlavi inscriptions on the old wall at Darband, dated variously at first, but with a final general consensus to the 6th century. Thus, the author of the Syriac legend was using common lore that would be readily understood by its audience. It's also interesting to note that the Alexander legend itself combines two other traditions: Alexander's building of a wall, as well as the identification of Huns. So the linguistic and thematic parallels seem secure, the dating seems secure, and not only that, but it's drawing on an earlier tradition or even earlier traditions that it's combined. But what about accessibility of these legends? Were they widespread enough for Muhammad and his band of merry men to come in contact with them? The success or popularity of the Alexander legend is indicated in that it was used by at least 3 more apocalypses. The Alexander legend was evidently well known in the early 7th century. So could the Syriac version be drawing from the Quran? Well, the Syriac text contains no references to the Arabic language, the type of which one might expect to find if its purpose was to explain an Arabic text, and it is impossible to see why a Syriac apocalypse written around 630 would be drawing on an Arabic tradition some years before the Arab conquests, when the community at Mecca was far from well known outside Arabia. Moreover, the very specific political message of the Alexander legend would not make any sense in this scenario. This possibility must therefore be discounted. Perhaps cohering nicely with Andy Bannister's dissertation, he says the Quranic account must draw from the Syriac account, if not directly, then by oral report. Now let's pause for a humor break. Maududdi's commentary. He poses some questions and criticisms of this methodology. Check out all of these scare quotes. He says the Orientalists have, as usual, tried to make a research into the sources, calling them malicious scholars and their scientific research, concluding that the Quran's been plagiarized from such and such sources. We use facts and quotations cunningly and cleverly. But he poses some questions for us. Do you possess any knowledge that at the time of the revelation of the Quran there was a library at Mecca from which the Holy Prophet collected material for the Quran? Did anyone think of this objection up until this point in the video? No, I didn't think so. That's how absurd this is. How is it the contemporary disbelievers of Mecca were not able to put forward a single instance of plagiarism? But we know that Muhammad's contemporaries accused him over and over of simply retelling tales of the ancients. They called him the ear. This happens numerous places in the Quran. But Maududdi, of course, is going to reject these claims. So here's his logic. He rejects the accusations of Muhammad's contemporaries that Muhammad was simply retelling prior traditions. Therefore, he rejects modern claims because, according to him, they've produced no evidence in more than 1,000 years. So what makes us think that we're right? This is some sort of you have to make up a new term for this, a temporal fallacy, because the people back then were wrong about this issue, according to him, then the people today can't be right either. How many non sequiturs can you have in a single objection? The last and most important question is, does it not show that it is bigotry and malice, blah, 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 blah? No, it doesn't. It shows that people like me are more concerned about Muslims knowing the truth than Islamic scholars like Maududdi. Now, what is utterly lacking from all of this stuff in Maududdi's tafsir? Data, facts, proof. He has none of it. He has emotional objections. Speaking of facts, you know that prophecy in Surah 30? The Roman Empire has been defeated in a land close by, but they, even after this defeat of theirs, will soon be victorious. This prophecy actually has other very well-known parallels in the 7th century. We may do a video specifically on this at a later time, but for now, we'll just look at a quick quote. In the Alexander legend, a prophecy is given to him to the effect that the Romans would one day decisively defeat the Persians. That sounds a lot like the prophecy in the Quran, but according to the Quran, no one knows the future or the unseen except for Allah. To Allah belongs the unseen. So Muslims, if you want to claim that Roman victory is a prophecy in the Quran, then that also means it's a prophecy in the other contemporary 7th century traditions, which means that others aside from Allah also know the unseen, which means you just committed shirk. Now let's open up our study to more of Surah 18. We're going to add in that mysterious companion of Moses, starting at about verse 65. It's well known, of course, that his name is al-Qidr. Now, Qidr in Islamic literature is the one who gained eternal life when he drank from the fountain of life. He was an executive officer of Alexander the Great. He's also identical with Alexander's cook, who discovered the fountain of life by means of the salted fish. Now we're going to get deep into the tangled mess of Islamic tradition. Let's bring another character onto the stage. His name is Elijah. The Tishbite is no doubt the most prominent and the most popular figure in the legendary world of post-biblical Judaism. Striking attributes of Elijah are eternal life and omnipresence. Keep that in mind, okay? There's an 11th century Jewish scholar who quotes a tradition about Elijah. He accompanies a famous rabbi of the 3rd century on his travels and shows him several incidents which, on the surface, seem to militate against God's justice. The Quran's version of Surah 18 should be coming to your mind as we go through this, but when interpreted by the prophet, are revealed as wonderful instances of the wisdom and justice of divine providence. This is precisely how the story in the Quran goes. Let's look at some parallels. The rabbi wanted to accompany Elijah on a journey, but the rabbi was prohibited from asking any explanation of Elijah's actions. In the Quran, Moses wanted to follow someone on a journey, but was prohibited from asking about any of the actions that Qidr would take. In the Jewish legend, we have a wall that was broken down. Elijah prayed that the wall might erect itself, and lo, it stood upright. From the Quran, Moses and his companion found a wall on the point of falling down, but he set it up straight. And as we noted earlier, both of these accounts end with an interpretation. Now, which of these is earlier? Is the Quran relying on prior tradition? You can guess what my answer to that question is. The antiquity of the legend is attested by Muhammad, who reproduces it in the Quran. There is no valid reason to doubt the Jewish origin of this legend. Elijah also appears as the vindicator of God's justice in the old Haggadah, preceding the Quran by centuries. And as we saw, that's exactly the role that Elijah plays in this tradition attributed to the 3rd century. Now, did you think that we would be talking about sea monsters in this video? You know, I'm going to throw some sea monsters in at no extra charge. Qidr literally means the green one, representing the freshness of spirit and eternal liveliness, which corresponds with the original designation of the sea demon into which Alexander's cook was transformed when thrown into the sea. So there's a further allusion in Islamic tradition to the Alexander legend. Now there's some more interesting developments about Qidr other than the whole sea monster thing. Let's take a look at those. He's one of the 4 prophets whom the Islamic tradition recognizes as being alive or immortal. We see some parallels here with Elijah in the Talmud. Michael reaches his destination in 1 leap, Gabriel in 2, Elijah in 4. Because of Elijah's miraculous travel abilities, he attends every circumcision ceremony performed in a Jewish family. They keep a chair for him, and he visits every Jewish home on Passover Eve. What about Qidr? Well, he gets around too. He was known to travel great distances in short periods of time. He became known for daily prayer circuits that included prayers at major monuments in various cities. The Quran and Islamic tradition as a whole are nothing but a patchwork quilt of prior traditions. Qidr, as conceived in Islam, is not derived from one definite source, but is rather the composite of a large number of legends and myths of widely divergent origin and character. Put more succinctly, these traditions, historically speaking, are inherited from earlier myths and faiths. It's been a long video, so let's make it a short summary. We've utterly destroyed the Islamic Awareness article defending the Quran's dependence on the Alexander myth. We've seen exceptionally sound historical circumstances, linguistic parallels, and thematic correspondences contributing to the conclusion that the Quran was borrowing from the Alexander legend. We've also seen that the Alexander legend was a widespread, very influential work and would have no trouble reaching Arabia in written or oral form. We've seen Islamic tradition as a whole, like the Quran, is nothing but a patchwork quilt of prior traditions. Friedlander had it right when he said the fountain of life in the Quran and the Elijah legend were made to follow one another in a most artificial and clumsy manner, welded into one continuous narrative. Is this all really from Allah, Muslims? Wake up. Look at the evidence in this video and elsewhere on this channel and others. Look at the evidence, look at the data, look at the proof, and don't be afraid to draw the intellectually responsible conclusion. Islam is a sham. Thanks for watching.